Yeah.
Today, we're talking about the kind of microaggressions no one prepares you for, the ones that come from another woman. Microaggressions look like the subtle comments, the tone shifts, the correction that feels like a power move, but it's not overt and it's not open conflict, and the voice in your head that says, maybe I'm just being sensitive. We're going to break down why these moments hit so deeply and share four grounded ways to respond without shrinking, spiraling, or self betrayal. Welcome to Communication Skills for Working Women. I'm Elizabeth.
And I'm Rose May. Do you find yourself second guessing or avoiding conversations because you're worried about being misunderstood?
You're not alone. On this show, we're sharing tangible tools for assertiveness, emotional resilience, and real life communication wins and fails.
Let's sharpen our communication together. So just as we get started, a definition of microaggressions are the everyday, subtle, and often unintentional slights, insults, or put downs directed at marginalized groups. They're small, they're common verbal or nonverbal exchanges like backhanded compliments or stereotypes that communicate hostile, negative messages to people based on their race, their gender, identity, sexual orientation. I mean, honestly, you could name it, whether or not they stay home, whether children or prefer to work, like any group, marginalized group of individuals. And I wanted to start by telling a story because it's pretty raw for me, but it reminded me of experiences that I've had in multiple situations. And the characteristics of each of these situations, the nuanced characteristics of each of these situations, is really what shapes kind of the dynamic of the interaction. So it's three very similar situations, but the nuances of each are very interesting. And so I'm sharing a story about two black women in a workplace, and one feeling slighted by the other, and getting into a conversation. And the conversation is, no, I wouldn't say heated necessarily, but it's a little bit emotional. And one of the black women saying to the other black women, using the words to describe their behavior, hostile and aggressive and contentious. Oh, that was the other one. Hostile, aggressive, and contentious. Now, I know both of these individuals. Neither of them is actually any of those words in any situation. I've known them a couple years, both of them. And so, and so that's a very special situation because Elizabeth and I were having this conversation earlier. There are some unspoken rules. The words aggressive, hostile, contentious are stereotyped words that are often directed at black women, um, by other groups, by other ethnic groups, to describe perhaps differences in communication style, or I would say like the lack of reciprocating the same kind of communication. And I'm trying to think about how to paint this picture. Um, but if we're thinking about it from a historical lens, perhaps what others might experience as the coldness as aggression or tension, when it's really just protective and mm, and a cry for safety, or an indication that they're not, that certain groups aren't feeling safe. And so I witnessed that, and it has been very triggering for me because I've experienced this. I've never experienced this from another black woman. That was, again, this didn't happen to me, but I happened to be there, and that was so incredibly shocking to me. And not that I'm naive enough to believe that these kinds of interactions don't exist, but that there's kind of an unspoken code that we don't use those words that marginalize us with each other. So there's that experience that I'm kind of in the middle of. I found myself to be in the middle of. And then it reminded me of other experiences where this has actually happened to me, and it's been directed to me from white women, and the feeling that is associated with that. But then also watching other white women do this to white women. And so I feel like I've seen this and witnessed this in a couple of different situations, and each situation is shocking. I think it's more personal to me because I've watched these experiences with white women and other white women. I've had this experience of white women doing this to me, and then taking it one step further in my, I guess, in my system, my personal systems or my social systems, is a black woman doing this to another black woman. And I asked Elizabeth if we could kind of tailor this episode to speak on that and talk a little bit about some things that might be helpful in these kinds of situations. But you're kind of hearing me process in real time because I really am very much like not only triggered by this, but still pretty shocked and in disbelief. I don't know. So yes,
So,
this is what you're hearing.
and we talked about this a little bit ahead of time and decided to do this on a kind of more unfiltered edge as I consider these different things. I hate it when we talk about stuff that I'm like, man, I know I've done that before. I know I've been the one that has maybe said something or made a verbal or made a nonverbal gesture that was kind of would shut somebody down or something like that. Um, and so I want to just say too, like, I'm definitely not perfect in any of these things, but they impact other people. And when we bring awareness to things, we can change our behavior.
Absolutely.
So,
An
or-
example, sorry, there was like an example of in the definition we talked about like backhanded compliments, right? And I think I gave an
Mhm.
example of the stereotypes, right? Aggressive, hostile, right? Contentious, right? But sometimes the backhanded compliments, you think they're a compliment, and then you think about it for a second, you're like, wait, that wasn't a compliment. One that is common and that has been said to me multiple times is, oh, you're so articulate. The implicit belief behind that is, I'm black, I must not be articulate. But hearing someone who can speak, I don't know, a certain way is shocking and deserves a compliment, right? That's a backhanded compliment. That's a microaggression. Um, there was a poll in a group that I was in a couple weeks ago, and I can't remember the prompt, but it was something like, "What's the most shocking thing anyone's ever said to you?" or something like that. And when I was a teenager, I remember for this particular situation, I was in a predominantly white, yeah, like community. This was actually at church, and someone said to me, "You know, Rosemary, you just have a very exotic look." And when I was like 15, I was like, dang. Like, I didn't know what that meant. And when I got that prompt a couple weeks ago and that memory came back to me, I was like, that was a what? That was
Right.
crazy. That was right. So it's like you think it feels like a compliment, but you're like, no, there's something about that that's not
Right.
a compliment. And that's along the lines of like a microaggression. And the same could be like, I'm sure like many of us who've worked in situations or in spaces where that is predominant, that are predominantly male, we've all experienced this in some way, shape, or form where you think you're kind of getting a compliment, but you think about it, you're like, no, that was not a compliment in any way, shape, or form.
And like, I mean, this is we're focusing on women doing this to other women. I see it all the time, it happening with other women. Now, I also want to be very clear. Like, I think I could tell you, Rose, that you're very articulate and it wouldn't be a microaggression.
Because I know where you're coming from.
Exactly.
And I
And
know
so,
you would say that to anybody who,
exactly,
yes,
who is
yes,
articulate. So,
yes.
and I bring that up because when we have these harder conversations, we can start to get defensive and be like, well, I can't give anybody a compliment because then they're going to think I am don't really mean it or or how does she know that that person really wasn't just like, "Oh, wow, you're really articulate. Maybe I need to be more articulate." We know when a microaggression is happening to us because we can feel it in our bones.
Yes.
And so it doesn't mean you can't say to someone, "Oh my gosh, you are incredible in being able to put all of this together in such an organized way."
Mm-hmm.
I have been told that by people who sincerely mean it. And I have been told that by people, and it feels awful.
Mm-hmm.
So part of this conversation is meant to like bring awareness to yourself of times you might be communicating in a way that's really harmful
Mhm.
and trust yourself when you're experiencing something.
Yeah, absolutely. And context matters, right? Like
Totally.
we were just saying, like Elizabeth and I have been friends for a very, 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 very long time. So if Elizabeth were to say that to me, I know where that's coming from. I know where that, yes, I know what the intention is behind that. And to be honest, my first thought I would kind of tilt my head a second, but for just a second, but then I would remember like we have years and years and years and years of friendship. Like it's not the same, right? The
Right.
word itself is a trigger, right? Because it's been used in a different way. So I think that that's what causes me caution and pause. But when I think about it, I recognize exactly where it's coming from. And so
Which,
it's context dependent.
right. And so getting curious, getting clear, taking that time to consider different things.
I'm disappointed and I'm saddened when I see women do this to other women. And I will say that there in all three of these situations there was a lateral relationship, right? There wasn't a hierarchy in
Mhm.
relation to the structural organization. Um for sure the social organization when we're talking about white on white and white and black and black. For sure like the social organization, but the structural organization within the companies or the spaces, yes, a very just equilateral relationship. So that
I
is
would agree, like that
also,
is where I see it
yeah, yeah, and
amongst peers
yeah,
more than through a hierarchy.
yeah. And I think that again, this is like social hierarchy, yes. Like when we're thinking about the tenets of or the social hierarchies in race, for sure. Um, yeah, so again, like just going back to context and how this matters is really important to recognize that as well. At which and the context and the hierarchy is going to determine kind of how we respond
Yeah.
in some situations.
Yeah. So we're going to actually go through and talk about four different ways that you can respond when you are experiencing a microaggression. So remember to trust yourself. Again, when you're feeling that compliment or that look or something that doesn't land well, um, recognize that as a microaggression. So the first tip is to name it without over explaining. When microaggressions come from women, many of us feel pressure to soften, justify, or educate. But clarity doesn't require a dissertation.
Hmm.
Simple interruptions matter. You can try a few of these. That didn't land well with me. I want to pause on how that was said. I experienced that as dismissive. So you're naming the impact there. You're not being disrespectful. You're not explaining a million things around it. You are simply naming how their behavior impacted you. And it's not the intent of their comment, it is how their comment actually impacted you. And you're allowed to do that without asking permission. So you can just say, someone can say something to you, and you can just say, I want to pause on how that was said, or that didn't land well for me. I really like that one. That didn't land well for me.
Yeah, and I think that that opens a space for a conversation, right? That if you decide that you want to have a conversation, right? That didn't land well for me. Tell me more about what you meant by that.
Right.
I think that just gives people a second to pause and to actually reflect on what they're saying and why they're saying it.
Hmm.
Yeah. Number two, stop minimizing just because it was subtle. Because these moments sometimes aren't overt, like oh, Rosemary, you've got a really exotic look, right? As women, we often downplay them. And we think, and I'm telling you, I thought about this when I was a teenager. These exact thoughts went through my head. Oh, she probably didn't mean it that way, or I don't want to make it awkward. In that situation, I do feel like it was a hierarchy culturally, right there for me and where my family comes from. we address adults differently than we do our peers, right? And so for me in that situation, there was a hierarchy, and I didn't want to make it awkward, and I didn't want to come across disrespectful. So I didn't want to make it awkward. And then I was like, okay, like it wasn't that bad, right? But that discomfort is information. If your body is tensing, if you replayed it later, if you felt smaller afterward, it mattered. And you get to decide how you want to navigate how that mattered to you, whether you want to think about it, um, or even like dive deep and really reflect on whether that's like a response like from other experiences you've had in your life. If it's a response that was entirely disrespectful and a microaggression, if you were having a bad day and you woke up on the wrong side of the bed, right? You get to decide like what that looks like for you, but it does matter. And being affected by that doesn't mean that you're fragile. It means that you're perceptive. You're either perceptive and reflective on yourself and how you are experiencing and navigating the world, or perceptive to the situation that might actually be a very harmful situation.
Something I keep thinking about as we're talking about this tip is the power of your peers in a situation like this.
Mhm.
If this happened, someone spoke to you in that way, and I was sitting there talking to you about it after, validating that this was like
Mhm.
asking, how did that impact you when they said that? If someone didn't say it, I'm thinking about my daughters. People say things to girls all the time that they just really shouldn't. And
Yeah, that's real.
and it's just making me think too, as a mom, like I need to say to them, like, not in that moment when the person's right there, but later, how did that land for you when so and so said this?
Yeah, I like that you're saying that. I think it's important too to check in with people that you trust. Obviously, your kids trust you. I'm thinking about a situation once. Oh, wow, this is bringing up a lot for me. It was right after the incident with George Floyd, and I was pulled over, and I was in the U.S. By myself. My family's very, very far away. I was pulled over. And this was right before I was going to a meeting, and I was pulled over, and I was at a stoplight. I was like the second car in the stoplight. So there wasn't anything as far as I could see or I could tell that I was doing that would have caused me to be pulled over. I was on my way home from the gym and I was driving to a meeting, right? So I get through the stoplight, and as soon as I get through the stoplight, cop behind me flips his lights on. I didn't even know there was a cop behind me. But so the lights weren't on at the stoplight, but as soon as I went through the stoplight, the lights flipped on. And it sent me into a full blown panic attack. I thought, what if this cop shoots me? No one's going to find me. No one's going to see me. No one's going to know. I mean, it might be some time before somebody actually knows that I didn't show up to a meeting, right? And this wasn't, this was like one of those, like, kind of, no, not necessarily mandatory. It was kind of optional, but, and so there wouldn't be a reason for me to like have to be there, you know? But I went into a state of like emotional dysregulation that I have not experienced in a long time. Cop pulls me over. He's like, "Your tags are expired." And I looked at him. I was like, "What?" And I realized my tags weren't expired. I just forgot to change my sticker. That's what it was. So I gave him my registration, whatever. And it turned out to be fine in that way, but it was a very traumatic experience for me. And even talking about it now, it's really, really hard. And so I went to this meeting and I started to share why this was hard for me in that moment. And someone said to me, "Oh, you're being too sensitive.
Oh no.
Are you sure that they were pulling you over because you hadn't done anything? Are you sure you hadn't done anything?" That was the questioning, right?
Wow.
And so, like, even just thinking about like who you're checking in with, that might be something to consider, right? Choose people that you
Mhm.
trust. And at the time, I did think I could trust this group of people. And I learned very quickly that that was probably not the case as it related to some things. Uh, but also like finding people that you trust and who know you very well and you know them very well to check in can help us really differentiate between like what is acceptable behavior from others and what is not.
Mhm.
That was a tangent. Sorry.
That
I told
was,
y'all I'm processing this in real time.
and thank you, Rose. Thank you for processing that in real time and for sharing a story that is vulnerable. And I hope that everyone listened to it with an open heart and mind and thinking about it within your own self. Like, we all are impacted by the world in which we live.
Mm-hmm.
And just because I'm being impacted one way doesn't mean someone else isn't being impacted in a completely different way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really important to be curious and support other people and listen. I mean, the response that you got was not helpful.
No, they said it with a smile on their face. Like, I'm sorry. Now the flashbacks are coming back now. They said it with a smile on their face, right? Again, it's like that weird thing where it's like, what are you being mean? What is happening?
Right.
Anyways, we can move on, but that's what that was like for me.
All right. Our third tip, set boundaries that match the relationship. Here you go.
Mhm.
Not every microaggression requires confrontation, and not every relationship deserves access to you. So you learned a lot in that. That
I
was the
did.
perfect example for
I
this
absolutely.
tip.
Some people do not have access to me to this day.
Right. And you
Mhm.
learned a lot in that, and
Mhm.
you didn't have to talk to the person about it after. Like,
Nope.
you
I
can then just set a boundary.
Yep.
So, some things to ask yourself. Is this someone I need to work with closely? Do they have power over me? Is repair possible, or is protection more realistic?
Hmm.
So, here's how boundaries might look: addressing it directly, redirecting the conversation, limiting personal disclosure, or emotionally disengaging without explanation. So Rose and I were actually talking about this before we started this, how I said, well, emotional disengagement, to me, that's almost like a coping mechanism in an unhealthy relationship. But in the example that Rosemary just gave, that is a completely appropriate way to handle that. Emotionally disengage. You don't need to give any explanation and just continue on.
Yeah.
So, boundaries aren't punishments, they're not manipulative, they are self respect in action.
When we are using them correctly, I think sometimes we assume that boundaries are a lot of I've heard boundaries is I have a love-hate relationship with this word, but what how I've seen people exercise boundaries is by telling other people what they can't do, and that's not actually setting a boundary.
Right.
Setting a boundary is concerned with how you are going to show up in a relationship, right? That is a very personal, intentional way of being. And so when we talk about that, and if boundaries rubs you the wrong way, that's probably why, is because some people have manipulated that word to to create situations where they are exerting power over others, and that's not actually the way that it is defined or exercised or lived out. So exactly what Elizabeth said, there's self-respect in action.
Considering boundaries, I really like thinking about it in that you're very clear on your values and how you will and won't live your life. And
Exactly.
you can't, I mean, you will go nuts trying to have a boundary around every situation in every scenario.
Mhm.
But if one of your values is honesty, you know you're going to handle something honestly. That doesn't mean that you talk about everything. That might be, I'm honestly going to step away.
Yeah.
And so you're clear on the way you want to live your life, and then your actions follow that. Those are boundaries.
Yeah, and our last tip is process it with someone who believes you. Right? And just or believes in you, right? I think that's important. Like microaggressions thrive in isolation, especially when the harm is subtle and the source is supposed to be safe. And that is actually what I thought, that
Yeah.
this situation was supposed to be a safe situation for me. And I didn't, right? I didn't even need consensus. I didn't need someone to say like, "Oh, you're right." I just needed someone to say that sounds awful,
Hmm.
right? That's all I needed someone to say. And like my initial thought was, of course, like I'm getting pulled over because I'm the only brown person driving around at 6 a.m. And that was really hard for me. And even if someone didn't agree with that, like just being able to say, like, off the heels of a George Floyd incident, yeah, that would be pretty traumatic, right?
Hmm.
So talk it through with a trusted colleague at work, right? A mentor, definitely a therapist if you're feeling that. They'll give you some really good feedback, or a friend who doesn't rush you to forgive and forget. I, that is one thing I've learned too, is that people who can sit in discomfort with me or who can sit in hard times with me and aren't either like trying to fix things immediately or trying to get me to like look at the silver lining or to forgive and forget are the ones that I feel the safest with. I'm a reasonable person. Eventually, I'm going to get to whatever it is that is consistent with my values, whether that's forgiving that person or choosing to like terminate friendships or whatever it is. Like, I don't need you to tell me that. I just need somebody to be there with me. And when we can believe our friends, it helps to restore clarity, right? And clarity is what keeps these moments from becoming the internalized shame that I think we often experience. So, going back to this, what many women are assuming is, if I was serious, if it was serious, if it was a serious situation, I would know I'm just feeling a little bit discomfort. If it mattered, I'd feel angrier. If I can't explain it clearly, it must not be real. It's really, really difficult to explain a microaggression if you don't have a term for it, and if you
Mhm.
don't, if you've never addressed it before, right? But psychological harm doesn't require the volume of an experience, right? The subtle erosion still erodes.
So let's recap. Microaggressions are everyday, subtle, and often unintentional slights, insults, or put downs directed at marginalized groups. They are small, common verbal or non-verbal exchanges, like backhanded compliments or stereotypes that communicate hostile, negative messages to people based on their race, gender, or identity. The four truths that we talked about is you can name the impact without over explaining. Second, subtle harm still counts. Third, boundaries should fit the relationship, not an ideal. And fourth, validation restores clarity. You are not imagining it, and you are not responsible for making other women comfortable at the expense of your own dignity. You don't need to harden, and you don't need to disappear. You just need permission to trust yourself and to take action.
Connect with us on Facebook at Communication Skills for Working Women. Thanks for listening. Until next time, speak clearly and listen bravely. When you feel confident in your communication, everything changes.
We'd love to hear your wins, failures, and insights on Instagram at Communication Skills for Women. Leave a review and connect with us.
Until next time, speak clearly and listen bravely.